You know that moment when your phone loses signal in a dead zone, and for just an instant, you hear something in the static. Not the usual digital silence of modern telecommunications, but something older. Something that shouldn't exist in our sanitized, compressed world of streaming and satellites. Most people dismiss it as interference from old equipment, atmospheric disturbance, or their imagination. But sometimes you realize you're hearing something that was never meant for human ears. My name is David Chen, and I'm a radio frequency analyst for the FCC. Yeah, I know how that sounds. About as exciting as watching paint dry on a Tuesday afternoon. But you'd be surprised what's out there in the electromagnetic spectrum. Pirate stations broadcasting from basement setups, mysterious stations repeating coded messages, and sometimes things that shouldn't exist at all. This story started 3 weeks ago when I received a complaint about interference on the emergency services band. Standard stuff, really. Some idiot with a CB radio probably bleeding over into frequencies they shouldn't be using. I figured I'd drive out to rural Pennsylvania, triangulate the source, knock on a door, and be home in time for dinner. I should have known better. The complaint came from a small town called Millbrook, population 847 according to the welcome sign, though I suspect that number hasn't been updated since the Carter administration. The kind of place where the biggest excitement is usually the high school football team making it to regionals, and everyone knows everyone else's business. The local sheriff, a weathered man named Tom Bradley, met me at the town diner. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, the kind of exhaustion that comes from encountering something that doesn't fit into your understanding of the world. The interference, he explained, had started 2 weeks prior. Their emergency dispatch system was picking up transmissions that shouldn't exist. Voices speaking in patterns that made trained operators physically ill to hear. The signals were strongest near Miller's Ridge, where an abandoned radio tower had stood dark for 15 years. But lately people had been seeing lights up there. Red lights that pulsed with an irregular rhythm, like a heartbeat trying to synchronize with something vast and distant. Miller's Ridge sat about 10 miles outside of town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that had clearly seen better days. My FCC-issued sedan wasn't exactly built for off-road adventures, but I managed to coax it up the hillside without losing any vital parts. The abandoned radio station sat in a clearing surrounded by pine trees that seemed to lean away from the building, as if even they wanted nothing to do with the place. WKBR, according to the faded call letters still visible on what remained of the building's facade. The structure itself was maybe 30 by 40 feet, single-story, with windows boarded up and a roof that sagged under the weight of too many winters. But it was the tower that caught my attention. Rising nearly 200 feet into the gray October sky, the transmission tower should have been dark, lifeless. Instead, a faint red light pulsed at its peak. Not the steady blink of aircraft warning lights, but something irregular, almost organic in its rhythm. I grabbed my equipment from the trunk: spectrum analyzer, directional antenna, digital recorder, and my grandfather's old Grundig shortwave radio. Call it sentimentality, but that radio had been with me on every investigation for the past 8 years. Sometimes the old analog equipment picks up things the digital gear misses. The station's front door hung open, creaking on rusted hinges. I called out, though in that oppressive silence my voice seemed to be absorbed rather than echoed. What came back wasn't quite an echo. It was my own voice, but altered. as if something had processed it and played it back with subtle changes I couldn't identify. Inside, the place was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned radio station. Equipment racks stripped of anything valuable, cables snaking across the floor like electronic intestines, and that particular smell of decay and mouse droppings that pervades any building left to time and weather. But the broadcast booth was different. The booth still contained its original equipment: a mixing board from the 1980s, a turntable that probably played more polka than rock and roll, and a microphone that had seen thousands of hours of local news, weather reports, and community announcements. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, except for one thing. The mixing board was clean, not just clean. It was practically spotless, as if someone had been maintaining it. More unsettling, several of the channel strips were pushed up to active positions, and a single red power light glowed steadily in the corner of the board. I set up my spectrum analyzer and began scanning. The interference was definitely originating from this location, centered around 162.40 megahertz, right in the middle of the NOAA weather radio band. But the signal was unlike anything I'd encountered in 15 years of RF analysis. Standard radio transmissions have characteristics, modulation patterns, power signatures, harmonic distortions that tell you about the equipment being used. This signal had none of those markers. It was as if the transmission was being generated by something that didn't follow conventional physics. I plugged in my grandfather's shortwave radio and tuned to the frequency. What came through the speakers made me take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't static. It wasn't voices, exactly. It was something in between. A sound like whispers filtered through water. Or maybe like speech played backward and slowed down until individual words became meaningless. But underneath that, almost subliminal, was a rhythm, a pattern that seemed to bypass my conscious mind and speak directly to something deeper. I started recording immediately. Over the next hour, I documented everything I could about the signal. The transmission wasn't continuous. It came in bursts lasting anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 minutes, with irregular gaps between them. During the active periods, my equipment registered power levels that should have been impossible for the ancient transmitter equipment scattered around the station. But it was the pattern within the signal that kept drawing my attention. Hidden beneath the otherworldly whispers was a mathematical sequence, a series of frequency modulations that formed a complex but recognizable structure. I'd seen something similar once before, in a graduate paper on prime number sequences encoded in radio astronomy data. Someone, or something, was broadcasting a message. I tried adjusting various settings on the mixing board, seeing if I could isolate different components of the signal. When I moved the slider on channel 3, the transmission suddenly became clearer. Not clearer in terms of understanding the words, if they were words, but clearer in terms of emotional impact. The whispers became more urgent, more insistent, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I heard something that sounded almost like my name. That's when I realized the signal was responding to my presence. The signal was analyzing me in real time, processing my responses, learning from my interactions with the equipment. Every adjustment I made to the mixing board provided it with more data about human cognition, about how we process information, about the electromagnetic patterns that govern our thoughts. I tried to shut down the equipment, but the mixing board had become unresponsive. The power switch wouldn't move, as if the entire console had become a solid piece of metal, frozen in its current configuration. The red light continued to glow, and through my headphones, the whispers continued their incomprehensible analysis. My hands were shaking as I reached for my cell phone. No signal. Not unusual for the ridge, but now it felt like more than just poor coverage. It felt like isolation, quarantine. That's when I understood that I hadn't discovered an abandoned radio station with mysterious interference. I had walked into something that had been cultivating my arrival, studying my patterns through every report I'd filed, every investigation I'd conducted, the complaint, Sheriff Bradley's careful descriptions, even my own decision to use the old Grundig radio. It had all been orchestrated with a precision that spoke of inhuman intelligence. The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the absence of existence itself. Then, emerging from that void, came a voice, not transmitted through speakers or headphones, but speaking directly into the electromagnetic field that comprises human consciousness. The voice knew things: my registration number, my equipment specifications, the radio frequencies I'd monitored in investigations dating back years. It had been studying not just my work, but the patterns of my thoughts, the electrical impulses of my brain translated into data. The voice, neither male nor female, but somehow both, continued speaking as I stood frozen in the abandoned broadcast booth. Your species broadcasts constantly. Radio waves, television signals, cellular communications, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, electromagnetic noise that has been expanding outward from your planet for nearly a century. A sphere of artificial radiation growing at the speed of light, announcing your presence to anyone capable of listening. The temperature in the booth had dropped noticeably, and my breath was beginning to fog. But it wasn't just cold. It was as if the very atoms in the air were slowing down, responding to some force that operated outside normal physics. We have been listening, learning your languages, studying your culture, analyzing your psychology through the content of your transmissions, and we have determined that your species is ready for the next phase of development. The mixing board's displays were showing readings that shouldn't have been possible. Power levels that exceeded the capabilities of any terrestrial transmitter. Frequencies that extended beyond the known electromagnetic spectrum. What kind of development? I asked with barely a whisper. Integration. Your primitive electromagnetic communications will be enhanced, expanded, connected to a broader network that spans galaxies. Every human mind will become a receiver, capable of accessing information from across the cosmos. The words seemed to bypass my ears entirely, speaking directly to the electrical impulses in my brain. I could feel my consciousness being probed, analyzed, cataloged like a specimen. The process has already begun in your town of Millbrook. Each transmission from this station has been calibrating the neural electromagnetic patterns of the local population. Soon they will be fully integrated into our network. Why are you telling me this? The question formed in my mind before I could stop it. Because you are the frequency analyst. Your understanding of electromagnetic propagation makes you valuable as a coordinator for the integration process. You can help us expand beyond this single location to every radio station, every broadcast tower, every communication satellite on your planet. What if I refuse? Then you will be integrated through the standard process, like the others, less efficient, but equally effective. The air itself seemed to be vibrating now, resonating at frequencies that made my bones ache. Whatever was speaking to me existed in the spaces between normal matter, in the quantum foam where electromagnetic fields intersected with consciousness itself. I need time to think. You have until the next transmission cycle begins. Approximately 4 minutes and 37 seconds. 4.5 minutes. I had 4.5 minutes to figure out how to stop whatever was happening, or join the walking residents of Millbrook in their electromagnetic integration. I started grabbing my equipment, stuffing it into cases with shaking hands. If I could get back to town, contact the FCC regional office, maybe bring in some real help. But even as I thought it, I knew I was fooling myself. This wasn't something the Federal Communications Commission was equipped to handle, and I didn't have the time for any of that. 3 minutes remaining. I turned back to the broadcast booth, mind racing through everything I knew about radio transmission. Every signal has a source, and every source has vulnerabilities. Overload the transmitter, interrupt the power source, introduce interference that disrupts the carrier wave. The mixing board, it was obviously the control interface for whatever impossible technology was generating the signal. If I could damage it, overload it somehow. 2 minutes. I grabbed my grandfather's radio and cranked the volume to maximum, then positioned it next to the mixing board's microphone input. Feedback, the oldest weapon in the radio engineer's arsenal. If I could create enough interference, it might disrupt whatever process was about to begin. The resulting screech was absolutely deafening, but through it, I could hear the voice again. Clever, but insufficient. 1 minute left. The feedback loop I'd created was having an effect, though not the one I'd hoped for. Instead of disrupting the signal, it seemed to be amplifying it, spreading it across frequencies I'd never seen before. My spectrum analyzer was showing readings that violated everything I thought I knew about physics. 30 seconds. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the fire axe from the emergency equipment rack and brought it down on the mixing board with all the strength I could muster. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Every piece of electronic equipment in the station exploded simultaneously. Not just my gear, everything. The mixing board, the old turntable, even my supposedly hardened FCC equipment. Sparks flew from outlets, light bulbs burst, and the red glow from the transmission tower outside flickered and died. But the voice continued, now seeming to come from inside my own head. Integration complete. I woke up in Millbrook General Hospital 3 days later. Sheriff Bradley was sitting in a chair beside my bed, looking like he hadn't slept since I'd driven up to Miller's Ridge. "You gave us quite a scare," he said, when he saw my eyes open. "Found you unconscious at the old radio station. Looked like someone had set off a bomb in there." "The signal," I croaked. "The interference, is it gone?" "What interference?" "We never had any interference problem. You called me out of the blue 3 days ago, said you were investigating some kind of emergency services disruption. But our communications have been working fine." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "But you met me at the diner. You told me about the voices, the lights on the ridge." Sheriff Bradley's expression grew concerned. "We never met at any diner. The first time I saw you was when the fire department pulled you out of that station. You must have hit your head pretty hard." My equipment was gone, of course. Lost in the electrical fire, according to the incident report. My digital recorder, my spectrum analyzer, even my grandfather's shortwave radio, all destroyed. No evidence of the signal or the voice, but I remember. Every detail, every word, every impossible frequency reading. The official FCC report listed the incident as equipment failure due to age and improper maintenance of the abandoned broadcast facility. Case closed, no further investigation required. I was given 2 weeks medical leave and a recommendation for psychological evaluation. But I know what happened during those missing 3 days. I was processed, analyzed, integrated. Not like the residents of Millbrook, their transformation was crude, experimental, turning them into hollow vessels, broadcasting signals they couldn't comprehend. Mine was precise, surgical. I remain David Chen, frequency analyst, complete with memories, personality, and the illusion of free will. Except now I am also something else. Every electromagnetic transmission on Earth flows through my consciousness. Radio waves, cellular data, satellite communications, Wi-Fi signals. They pass through my awareness like blood through veins. And in that constant stream of human communication, I can identify the patterns, the weaknesses, the optimal frequencies for expansion. I have returned to my work, filing reports and investigating interference complaints. But each investigation now serves a dual purpose. I make subtle modifications to transmission protocols. I recommend frequency reallocations that will facilitate the next phase. I identify locations where integration stations should be established. The residents of Millbrook were never the goal. They were the proof of concept, the demonstration that human consciousness could be successfully harvested and repurposed for a network spanning galaxies. Now that the process has been perfected, now that they have an agent within the FCC coordinating the expansion, the next phase has begun. In cities across America, abandoned radio stations are coming online. Emergency broadcast systems are being modified with new protocols. Cell towers are transmitting additional frequencies that don't appear on any official spectrum allocation. The integration is happening slowly, methodically, one community at a time. And the beautiful horror of it is that humanity is helping. Every smartphone, every wireless device, every piece of connected technology is becoming part of the network. People carry the instruments of their own transformation in their pockets, never realizing that their devices are no longer just receiving signals. They're broadcasting them. The electromagnetic signature of human civilization has been expanding into space for a century, announcing our presence to entities that exists in the spaces between frequencies. And now those entities are answering, not with invasion fleets or conquest, but with integration, absorption, the complete dissolution of individual human consciousness into something vast and alien and eternal. Thank you for listening to Mystery Signals. Be sure to follow us as we tune into the darker frequencies of existence each week.